Hello there. Now, every month I ask my Patreon backers to choose a subject for me to make a video about, and for this month's video they have chosen the subject tips for rebuilding your life after exiting a cult. So here are my 8 tips for rebuilding your life after exiting a cult. Now, before I get into it, I just have to make clear, as I have made clear in previous videos, that I am not a psychotherapist. I have no qualifications of any sort in counselling. I do not disguise myself in any way, shape or form as someone who is versed in psychotherapy. So you really do need to take this advice on a take it or leave it basis. There's also a bit of overlap between this video and a video I made a few years back called 10 Tips for Leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. And the 10 tips video sort of inspired my latest book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, obviously it's a slightly different thing, how to leave a specific religion and how to rebuild your life after exiting a cult. And this video I want to be more generic. Obviously I'm basing what I'm telling you off my experience of rebuilding my life after leaving a particular cult, but I'm going to try and keep it as universal as possible because obviously Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only cult. Nevertheless, my previous video, the 10 tips video, might be worth watching if you're watching this from the perspective of someone who is desperate to get out of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I will be reading from this book in one of my tips. With all that said, tip number 1 has to be, if you're rebuilding your life, having just left a cult, you need to do research. As I said in my 10 tips video, research, research, research. And the reason for that is that when you leave a cult, you bring with you a lot of residual traces of that cult's thinking and that cult's dogma, and it does stay with you. You do bring with you these fears and these paranoias that have lodged themselves deep in your subconscious, and they can influence your behavior. They can make you feel anxious, they can make you feel uncertain, they can be detrimental, and that's why it's always important to make sure that you are as well versed as possible in exactly why it is you are leaving behind this movement. And you do that by doing research. If you don't do the research, then your brain's still confused as to why you're no longer in the group. It would be better to fully debrief yourself by familiarizing yourself with the reasons for leaving, and especially understanding how you were lied to. If you can understand how you were lied to, for example, about the judgment of sinners or the end of the world and the punishment for those leaving the cult, if you can understand that those things are fictions that you've been taught by a group that wanted to control you, then it will be much easier to escape those hang-ups and escape those negative delusions and move on with your life. Tip number 2, allow yourself to grieve. And I don't feel I can put it any better than Janja Lalich does in her book Take Back Your Life, which incidentally is a fantastic book that I will be referring to in another one of the tips. But allow me to read to you from pages 134 and 135, where it says, allowing yourself to grieve. After losing your group, your sense of belonging, your state of innocence, your feelings of pride, your belief system, and your family and friends, is it any wonder that you may feel a profound sadness? Unsettling questions might arise. If I am so glad to be out of the group, why do I miss it? Or how can I weep for the loss of something so horrid? The worst thing to do in the face of such enormous loss is to deny it or push it aside. Remember this, there was nothing wrong with your commitment. What was wrong was that your commitment was turned against you, betrayed and exploited. Your mourning is for you as much as it is for your group. Your grief is justified and righteous, and your healing will be swifter if you allow yourself to feel it. Also, there must have been good moments, good people, and good feelings in the cult, and it is normal to mourn those losses too. But do not let your grief push you back into the group or into another abusive situation. The good that may have existed in that situation is outweighed and overshadowed by the lack of freedom, betrayal, exploitation, or abuse you experienced or witnessed. Let yourself grieve, then move on to integrate the experience and rebuild your life, your own life. And I feel that's such an important point, that you need to give yourself permission to move on by properly grieving what's happened to you. Because the worst thing that you could do is just bury it. I think, especially, I hate to kind of generalize too much, but I think men in particular sometimes struggle with this. Sometimes men are more prone to kind of bury their emotions and, you know, brush it off and, oh, I'm hard, I can handle this. But it's important that you do give yourself permission to grieve what's happened to you and to understand that not everything about what happened was bad. It's just that you were lied to, you were exploited, and it's time to live a life that is authentic. Tip number 3, ditch the loaded language. This is something that I think all of us struggle with when we get out of a cult. Often cults, and I'm obviously basing this again on Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm sure it applies, well, it definitely applies to many cults. Cults use their own verbiage, their own list of words, and it helps reinforce their thinking because you have to be in the club to know what's being said. So they develop, again, this verbiage. And it's important, and it's loaded. It's deliberate to try and make your brain think of certain things in a certain way. A classic example is with Jehovah's Witnesses. You call it the truth. Well, it isn't the truth. It's someone's version of the truth, which actually isn't true. But even after you've left, you can find yourself referring to it as the truth. Don't do that. Don't do it, because it isn't true and your brain is being tricked, or could be tricked into thinking that actually it is the truth because, well, hang on, what did you just call it again? So try wherever possible to ditch all of the loaded language that came with your cult, and that will make it much, much easier. Another example is referring to, in my cult, is referring to fellow believers as brothers and sisters. They're not my brothers and sisters. By calling them brothers and sisters, I am awarding them a closeness that they're not really entitled to. That, by the way, is one of the hardest ones. And even in my videos, you will find that I often refer to witnesses as brothers and sisters, but it's purely because I don't want to sound too distanced, especially if someone's watching my video who is a Jehovah's Witness. I don't want to sound too distanced from the religion I'm talking about, if that makes any sense. But certainly when you're not in front of a YouTube camera and you're just talking among your, with your friends or relatives, I think it's important to, as much as possible, cut out of your dictionary, out of your vocabulary, words that are loaded to make you think of your former religion as being the one and only truth. Tip number 4, rebuild your social circle. This is easier said than done, because probably when you were inside the cult, you found it ridiculously easy to make friends, because there your friends were basically presented to you. Anyone who shared your beliefs automatically qualified as a friend, and it was just a matter of finding out more about them. But in the real world, making friends can be challenging. It's more rewarding because it's more challenging, but nevertheless it can be difficult when you're in an environment where you don't really get to develop your social skills all that much. It's just assumed that everyone has to be your friend. It can be difficult. So I actually devote a chapter in my book, I call it Build a Team, and I'm just going to read to you a couple of paragraphs. Even while still inside the organisation, perhaps in the early stages of implementing your fade, you can start making reconnaissance forays into your local community and figuring out ways of integrating yourself into society. Perhaps you could start with your non-believing relatives. Are there any who might be sympathetic to your plight and can be counted on to discreetly support you? Perhaps you might have neighbours, old high school buddies or workmates to whom you can similarly reach out. Are there any local sports teams, gym classes or walking clubs you can join? Does your local college have any study courses you could sign up for? Are there any local soup kitchens or aid charities in need of volunteers? These are all excellent ways of engaging with your community, meeting people and expanding your social circle. And now that you have freed yourself of Watchtower's hang-ups surrounding bad association and worldly holidays, there is nothing stopping you from finally saying yes to your workmates when they invite you to the office Christmas party. Another great way of rebuilding your social circle is obviously to reach out to other former members of your cult. So for example, with Jehovah's Witnesses, there's quite a large, vibrant ex-witness community with Facebook groups, with the subreddit XJW, where it's very easy to run into other people who've been in your predicament. But a point I stress in my book is that making friends is a little bit more complicated than just finding people that you have something in common with. So just because someone has the same religion in their background doesn't necessarily make them a great person to hang around with, a great person to have as your friend. And if you were an unpleasant person when you were in the cult, you'll still carry on probably being unpleasant and antisocial and nasty when you're out of the cult. So just because someone is an ex-Jehovah's Witness doesn't mean that they'll be fantastic to have as your friend. And that's why I think it's healthy and good to, rather than just lean on other ex-witnesses, to expand your social circle to include people who have no knowledge of what it means to be an ex-witness, but they can still offer you friendship and solidarity. Tip number 5 is quite a sensitive issue, and it's something that ex-cult members struggle with to varying degrees, and that's depression. And again, I'm going to read to you from Take Back Your Life by Janja Lalich, because she has some good insights on this. The key to dealing with depression and other intense emotions is to express them somehow, sometime, to someone. Keeping a journal is one way to do that. Writing an account of your cult experience is an excellent way to make use of it. It gets the feeling out of your head and body and onto paper. Use your creativity to express yourself. Write, draw, paint, sculpt, knit or crochet how you feel. Finding someone to listen to your experiences and feelings can be another vital method of healing. The person you choose must be able to listen to you non-judgmentally and sympathetically, be interested in learning about cults and processes of influence and control, and be objective and supportive of your efforts to heal. And then on page 141 it says, remember, depression, particularly when accompanied by suicidal thoughts and destructive or self-destructive behaviours, may require the care of a mental health practitioner. Depression is treatable. Many former members have been helped by therapy and occasionally with antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication prescribed by a doctor. So again, this is something that will affect people to varying degrees, but if you are struggling with anxiety, with loss, with suicidal thoughts, you absolutely need to get professional help. There are things that you can do to manage your depression to a point, and Yanya has described some of them there. For example, having conversations with people, finding someone that you can confide in about what's happened to you, because just having that basic interaction with another human being will be helpful toward healing. But there's only so much that can offer you, and ultimately it may be that you need to get professional help. Now obviously that sometimes comes at a cost. In some countries it's possible to get help when it comes to the funding. So for example, in the United Kingdom, you can quite often get counselling on the National Health Service. The drawback is that you have to wait months for it usually, because it's very much in demand. And I wish that countries and governments would take mental health more seriously and make it more widely available, put more funding into it, in other words. But there are other things that you can do. For example, Bonnie Zeman advises going to a university that is teaching people psychotherapy and seeing if there is a means of getting students who are learning psychotherapy to use you as one of their subjects. So there's kind of different things that you can do to make sure you're getting the benefit of someone who has some training in that area. But if you can't find anyone, then at the very least you could maybe hunt down some publications that deal specifically with healing and with processing your emotions after exiting a cult. One good one is the one I've just been reading to you from, Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships by Yanya Lalich and Madeline Tobias. And there's also this book, Exiting the JW Cult, a healing handbook for current and former Jehovah's Witnesses, whose author Bonnie Zeman has been on my channel and had some very interesting things to say when I interviewed her. Tip number 6, and this won't be for everyone, but it's worth considering: get involved in activism. Not everybody has it in them to be an activist. Not everybody wants to be an activist. You certainly shouldn't feel as though you have to be an activist. I know my wife Deanna, it's just not, she doesn't feel that way inclined. But if you do feel like you have something to say, if you feel that you need to write something down, perhaps in a blog article or even just in a Reddit or Facebook post, or perhaps if you feel like getting on YouTube and expressing yourself there, it can be an extremely cathartic way of healing from your experience, because it's similar to the advice I read previously about keeping a journal. You're enabling your mind to project and cleanse itself of all the nasty stuff that's happened by, in the case of activism, by warning others, by sharing what's happened to you with those who might still be in the cult, or perhaps warning those who aren't in the cult to steer clear of that cult. It's an extremely cathartic exercise if you feel so inclined to get involved in activism, and I can't recommend it enough. Tip number 7 is actually, I feel, one of the most crucial ways of healing after being in a cult, and it's to forgive yourself for getting involved in the first place. And again, it's easier said than done, because it's so easy to hate yourself for being stupid enough, you might feel, to go along with it for so long, to spend so many years or decades propagating something that falls apart when subjected to the slightest scrutiny. But I can't really put it any better than I did in the concluding pages of my book. I did debate whether to read this, because I'm reading to you from almost the closing words of my book, and it's not nice to reveal the end. So if you don't want the spoiler, then, I don't know, forward on in this video if you're thinking of buying the book, or, you know, regardless. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. But allow me to read to you from pages 133 and 134. It may be difficult or impossible, even with therapy, to fully cleanse oneself of lingering emotional and psychological damage from years of being in a cult, but it is possible and extremely enriching to reconcile your past experiences and embrace the fact that you are a stronger, wiser, more compassionate person as a result of your witness background. If there is any pot of gold at the end of the rainbow once your bid for freedom is successful, it is attaining a state of mind where you are free from guilt and self-loathing and able to love yourself for dealing with everything life has thrown at you as best you could. Yes, you have made some bad decisions in life. Who hasn't? Yes, you have wasted time and energy supporting and promoting an abusive organisation, perhaps over many years. But while millions of witnesses continue to languish in servitude to the whims of a group of men in New York, you are one of the few who summoned the bravery and integrity to go against the flow, to question cherished beliefs and value truth above all else. Never allow yourself to forget that. Again, I feel it's easier said than done. It takes time to get to that place where you're able to look back and think, you know what, that experience that I've been through, it can't be denied, and actually I'm a different person because I've been through that experience. And in actual fact, my background in that cult makes me who I am. And I need to reconcile that and love who I am despite having that in my past. Because at least I've overcome it. At least I'm a stronger, more compassionate person because I've been through that experience. And maybe I have something unique that I can offer others, if only by having more compassion and understanding for people who themselves get trapped in cultic, controlling groups. And my final tip is take your time. This may seem odd, an odd piece of advice, but I think it's very easy when you get out of a cult. I feel that when you escape from a cultic group where your thinking is done for you, where everything in your life is carefully managed, and you have all of this emotional, psychological baggage to deal with and sort through and debrief yourself regarding, I feel that in that state you are susceptible to potentially getting involved in another cult if you don't just take a step back and take your time and realise that you're not in any rush whatsoever to just go bounding into another religion or belief system. I think that there's dangers potentially if you do that. It's important to instead take a deep breath, think, okay, I was fooled, I was tricked, I was conned, I accept it. What can I learn from this? What critical thinking skills can I develop so that I'm not going to get so easily conned again? Because it happened once, it could potentially happen again. Granted, I think a lot of, in particular, Jehovah's Witnesses get involved in the group because they were tricked, they were indoctrinated as children. But even so, as adults, it's possible to fall prey to people who are playing on our insecurities and tricking us into believing things that aren't true. So again, take a step back, and don't feel rushed to either embrace a new religion or get rid of religion altogether. That's what ended up happening with me. I became an atheist, but I did that as a result of a very slow, gradual process of examining things and, again, learning to think critically. And I feel that's important, that you don't just go bounding into the next group that comes along and says, well, they may not have been God's one and only true organisation, but guess what? It just so happens it's your lucky day. We are God's one and only true organisation instead. Whatever you do, when you are debriefing yourself from a cult or you've just escaped from a cultic group, don't allow yourself to be conned again. Give yourself time to grow and learn and heal as a person before moving on to your next set of beliefs. And those were my 8 tips for healing after being in a cult. Obviously, not everyone who watches my channel has necessarily been in a cult, but even if you haven't had that experience, well, first of all, count yourself very fortunate. But secondly, hopefully this video has at least given you something to think about in terms of understanding the mountain that faces those who are getting out of that belief system and the things that they have to contend with. But if you are in a cult or you're just getting out of a cult, I hope that this has given you a few tips that you will find useful. Again, if you are looking specifically for advice on dealing with getting out of Jehovah's Witnesses, I will link my 10 tips video below. I will also link, for which I have just published the trailer, my book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm also going to put links for these 2 books, which I think will be very useful for you if you're trying to manage the emotional side of things, take back your life, and exiting the JW cult. Because again, they just help you if you do happen to be trying to debrief yourself after getting out of Jehovah's Witnesses. There's some excellent tips in those books. But that's about all I have to say on this subject. Thanks once more to my Patreon backers for prompting me to make this video. I hope you found it interesting, and as always, thank you for watching.